But Max, I want to switch
Well,
gears and talk about Ukraine because you had a recent column suggesting that those officials who are already writing off the Ukrainian counteroffensive as a failure are wrong. Why?
well, remember, even before the start of the Desert Storm ground offensive in 1991, which is kind of held up as kind of the perfect offensive operation, one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Even before the ground war started, there was something like 5 weeks of punishing airstrikes on Iraqi positions by U.S. and allied air forces. That's necessary to soften up the defenses before the ground troops go into action. Otherwise, they're going to suffer devastating casualties. Well, in the case of Ukraine, they don't have that air force that can inflict punishment from the air on the Russian forces. So they can't do the softening up from the air. What they have to do instead, a much more laborious and much more difficult process, is to try to soften up the Russian positions using, ground-based systems like the Storm Shadow, for example, cruise missile that they've gotten from the UK, or the HIMARS multiple launch artillery systems they've gotten from the United States. It just takes a while, and I think that they are, proceeding very, very slowly and very deliberately because they don't want to suffer devastating casualties. That's something that Russian commanders don't care about. They don't care how many of their own men they lose, but the Ukrainians are fighting for a democracy. They care about casualties, and so they don't want to just advance willy-nilly into these minefields and Russian trenches and suffer horrifying losses. What they're trying to do is to sever the Russian supply lines to make it much more difficult for the Russians to keep their forces in the field. Then they're trying to probe for weaknesses in the Russian lines across 600 miles of front. And then, and only then, if they find those weaknesses, if they degrade the Russian supply lines, only at that point will they commit the bulk of their NATO-trained, NATO-armed forces, which so far are not in the battle. So it's been about a month since the Ukrainians started their initial offensive operations. I think we just have to be patient. As President Zelensky and others have said, this is not a video game. This is not something that's going to be over in 30 minutes. It could take months to move the front, even if it's going to have success. So I think we just need to give the Ukrainians time to roll out their plan and not, beat the drums for faster action, which could result in a lot of dead Ukrainians, which is the last thing anybody wants.